I'm Hindol Sengupta. This is Global Order. My guest today was one of India's longest serving ambassadors to Nepal and also the former Foreign Secretary of India, Ambassador KV Rajan. Ambassador, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Great
Ambassador
pleasure.
Rajan is also the author of a wonderful new book on Nepal. He's a Nepal expert. He understands that country really well and the strange, if I may say so, relationship that India has with Nepal. His book very deftly explains how that relationship has developed and what are its quirks and idiosyncrasies and where perhaps it is headed. I am delighted that he's joined the conversation at a time when, as he was just saying before we began this interview, strange things are happening in Nepal. We will talk about all those strange things with Ambassador Rajan. I want to begin, sir, by asking you, in your opinion, and this question seems to be, crowding the conversation about Nepal today in Delhi and other parts of the world. How close is Nepal today to China, and how close is it likely to become in the years to come, in the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, initially it was Nepal which was trying to cozy up to China, partly to offset its dependence on India. The Chinese were really interested mainly in Nepal not permitting Tibetans to cross into India from Nepalese territory. That was their main interest. But subsequently, the Chinese have been raising their profile. And today, I would say both Nepal and China are trying very hard to cozy up to each other for different reasons. The Chinese, because quite clearly they have decided that it is in their long-term strategic interest to undermine India's influence in its neighborhood. I have no doubt about that. I was not initially of that opinion. I thought it was too alarmist some years ago. But now, having watched what's happening at very close quarters and watching what is happening around us in the Maldives, even other countries in our neighborhood, I have no doubt that it is a priority for China. And in the case of Nepal, well, there have always been elements which have been attracted to China for one reason or another. And those elements, unfortunately, are coming together. So I'm afraid India is in for a very difficult period now in the coming years because it will see China having a much higher profile, helped by Pakistan, because Pakistan will now really prefer to keep a lower profile. It was the other way around when I was in Nepal. It was Pakistan which was having a very high profile. But now the Chinese and their friends would be trying their best, and they would have friends in Nepal who would try to respond as much as possible. So I think the work is cut out for us, for our diplomacy and for our political leaders in Nepal. And the importance of being Nepal has possibly never been greater than it is today from a long-term strategic interest point of view.
It's a fairly grim picture that you paint, Ambassador Rajan. And of course, many people are saying these things, and you would know better than most other people. Talk to us a little bit about infrastructure projects that China has in Nepal. In Pakistan, one of the things people point out, of course, is that CPEC is going nowhere. But that's probably not the case with Nepal. What is the status of the big infrastructure projects which were, in a sense, spearheading China's engagement with Nepal?
No, China has the Chinese story as far as projects are concerned is not a major success story. In fact, it has been to our advantage because it has eroded China's own credibility and created a bit of suspicion in many Nepalese minds that China is being very self-serving when it talks about, the BRI projects in Nepal, when it talks about the airport in Pokhara, which is something of a white elephant, which it has constructed. So I would say on the economic front, the Chinese have not succeeded very much. And some of their projects have, in fact, not taken off very well. But it is more on the political and on the strategic plane that the Chinese are proving to be a bit of a magnet for many Nepalese. And also, partly, it's a result of how India has been playing its cards over the years. And that is why I thought that in this book, I would not just concentrate on what is happening today, but do an introspection of what has happened in the past. And I'm afraid there again, it's a bit of a mixed bag as far as India and Nepal are concerned. So it's a strange situation where the Nepalese, having warmed up to China very much a few years ago, are beginning to ask questions. They seem to respect India a little bit more in terms of India's own rising credibility in the world and India's own intentions. I think India's own intentions are far less suspect than Chinese intentions. So it's a game that is going on. It's a great game that is going on. And unfortunately, there are other economic interests which are also involved. There is a smuggling nexus which is very active in Nepal, and there is also an Islamic fundamentalist activity in Nepal, which I have more than a feeling the Chinese are conniving at also in their own way. So it helps the Chinese, to have that kind of an activity there. It's a very complicated scenario, I'm afraid. But on the economic front, I think we can say that what our engineers, our contractors, our diplomats have been doing over the years has impacted far more positively on the Nepalese. It has made a much greater difference to them on the ground than what the Chinese have done.
And yet, as you began by saying, India faces a very difficult situation. The Chinese presence is indeed growing. I want to pick up one thread of what you just said and dive deeper into it. We have heard this before, that as China faces more and more problems with the Uyghurs in its Xinjiang province, one of the places from where its BRI really takes off, as the troubles there grow, as it grows more restive, it is triggering this sort of Islamic fundamentalism in other parts of the world. And you mentioned Nepal. This is rarely ever discussed in detail. Can you tell us a little more about what's really going on in this? Because it seems contrarian, but people are increasing numbers of people are beginning to talk about this.
Well, what is happening in Nepal is that because of a combination of poor governance, the quality of democracy there, the political instability, which is quite chronic, and rampant corruption, and the lack of institutions, there's really no institutional underpinning now to free-for-all democracy, which one witnesses in Nepal. So that suits people who do not mean well by India because of the 1,700 kilometer long open border, which is today better regulated, but it is impossible to regulate that border with complete efficiency. In fact, in my time in Nepal, I remember once crossing over to the Indian side in my official car with the flag and so on. And the IAS officer who was in charge of the district came up to me and said, "Sir, I think it is not in your interest to go about." I said, "This is Indian territory. This is my country." And he said, "It is really not in your interest because both sides of the border, there is a belt which really is very difficult to control and extremely dangerous." During King Virendra's tenure as king, both as absolute monarch and later as constitutional monarch, the border was so loosely regulated on both sides. The Indian side was equally deficient that a lot of imported Islamic fundamentalism began to take root on the Nepalese side of the border. Suddenly, the entire Nepalese side of the border was dotted with mosques and madrasas and a lot of Islamic fundamentalist teaching, etc., etc. Until then, Nepal had been a very deeply religious Hindu state, but a very peaceful state, a very tolerant state with a very secular ethos in the real sense of the word. But then we began to see more and more of this activity. And strangely enough, on the Indian side of the border also, similar activities were taking place. So that is when uh, King Virendra personally began to get quite worried, because the one thing which these people really found somewhat uncomfortable to adjust to was Nepal's Hindu status. And there's no doubt about it that, there were a lot of tensions, and there were a lot of conversations between Nepal and Pakistan also, of which we don't have too many details. But that is when certain anxiety began to increase in Nepal about threats to its Hindu identity. And a corollary to that was threats to its continuance as a monarchy. And that was roughly the time when I joined as ambassador in 1995. King Birendra had learned a few lessons. He had taken a staunchly anti-India position earlier. That was partly due to India's support for democratic forces in Nepal and populist forces in Nepal, which were aimed against the monarchy. And when the pressures on the king became too much, King Birendra personally decided that he could not accept a state of a violent confrontation between the monarchy and populist forces, and he decided to give in to the popular demand to become a constitutional monarch. But he was somewhat alone in the palace, and there were other forces in the palace, including within his family, including his wife, Queen Aishwarya, his brother Gyanendra, who felt that he should be much more firm and try to put the agitation down. But King Birendra decided, because basically he was a peaceful man at heart, and he decided to go in for multi-party democracy and continue as constitutional monarch, but with control of the army. The army was totally loyal to the palace. So that was the exception to the rule. And the army was keeping its eyes and ears open about what was happening in the border, much more perhaps than the political parties. It depended on which political party was in power, but there were so many changes of government and with such great frequency that one could see that political parties and political leaders were really not as alert and as watchful about the expansion of fundamentalist forces on their side of the border. King Birendra, on the other hand, uh, two things were happening. One was, three things were happening, I would say. One was he was becoming more and more popular as disenchantment, public disenchantment with the inability of political parties and the democratic forces to deliver became clear because there was so much of a focus on coming to power, keeping power, etc., that there was very little governance after the first couple of years of my tenure. And so King Birendra became more popular because he was, that kind of a person. He was keeping up his communication with people. He was playing by the rules of the book, basically. And he was also coming closer to India. That was the second thing that was happening. A, he was becoming more popular. He was being accepted by the political parties as a Democrat at heart. Uh, B, he was coming closer to India. And the army was becoming much more worried about the activities of the smuggling mafia, the nexus based in Pakistan, and their activities, cross-border activities, drugs, arms, uh, and worse. And incidents taking place in India, sometimes very far away from the border, but which could be traced to what was happening at the border. So King Birendra was getting increasingly worried about that and confiding more and more, uh, with in conversations with me as well as with top leaders in India about his anxieties on the threats that Nepal was going to face very soon. So this is this is a summary of the picture that was evolving at
And
that time.
you're saying are coming true today.
Yes, indeed, absolutely.
Talk to us a little bit about the other thing that many people are beginning to talk about, which is a movement within Nepal to try and take it back to becoming a Hindu state once again. How valid are these movements? How do you see them pan out?
I think it is valid because, as I mentioned earlier, it is very difficult to imagine Nepal as a secular state in the Western sense. This is what the Maoists wanted. The Maoists were fighting from the jungle hideouts in India, and one of their top priorities was to get rid of temples, get rid of the Hindu religion, get rid of the identity of Nepal as a Hindu state. They made it absolutely clear. Uh, I think what unfortunately might have gone wrong was that the whole situation was reaching a stalemate because the Maoists had expanded their influence from the time they started in 1996. In just 3 to 4 years, they had expanded their influence to cover most of the Nepalese countryside. They had become very powerful. They were carrying on a lot of, quite a few killings and so on, senseless killings, I would say. Uh, and the king was not willing to deploy the army against the Maoists because he thought there would be a bloodbath and the army might not be capable of fighting the Maoists because they had not been in that role earlier. So the king was very worried about that. Uh, he was confiding in his conversations with Indian leaders and in his conversations with me about his growing anxiety. Unfortunately, uh, what happened within a few years, the massacre took place King Birendra was wiped out, Gyanendra took over. He decided to deploy the army against the Maoists, but the army couldn't cope. They couldn't win against the Maoists. The Maoists also couldn't win against the army, so they were also desperate. The army was getting very worried, and that is when the Maoists began to reach out in secret discussions to some people in the government of India, which was very worried about its own Maoist problem, because they thought if the Nepalese Maoists began to link up with Indian Maoists, which had begun to happen, then the problem would get greatly complicated. So I think some sections of the government of India, not necessarily the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister or some of the key political leaders, but some sections of the Indian government felt that maybe it was not a bad idea to persuade Nepalese political parties to come together and reach some kind of an understanding with the Maoists, which would not take a stand on the Maoist position that A, the monarchy should be abolished, B, that Nepal should cease to be a Hindu state, and that it should be left to Constituent Assembly to decide all those things. But in the process of discussing with Nepalese political leaders who were coming by plane loads to Delhi to take India's advice, because that is the other funny thing about the India-Nepal relationship. There is a big brother, small brother syndrome, which accounts for part of the problem. It is complicated by a tendency which has always been there on the Nepalese side to consult, within quotes, India on specific problems. And that tendency is matched by sometimes an enthusiasm on the Indian side to be consulted. And from there are small steps to giving unsolicited advice, to expecting that advice to be followed, to pushing and prodding Nepalese political players to accept Indian advice on the basis of its perceived national interests or its biases, as the case may be. So what happened, I believe, was that a section of the Indian government began to persuade political players in Nepal who were privately very hesitant. And in fact, they were reaching out to people and even making public statements. People like Koirala and Dioba and even Madhav Nepal, the UML, saying that if we give in to the Maoists without any preconditions, then it will be something of a walkover, because the Maoists will simply dictate their terms. And, we are really not in a position to stand up to them. But I think there was a bit of a desire to speed up the process. And very soon, we had one thing happening after another. And the Maoists were able to achieve their twin objectives of overthrowing the monarchy, getting rid of the monarchy. And of course, it was very much due to the mistakes that King Gyanendra had also made, that he became so unpopular and so on. But the other change, huge transformation, was the declaration of Nepal as a secular republic, which came as a huge shock to the people of Nepal, because, by tradition, by culture, by civilizational ethos, they were really not secular in that sense. Well, things have come a long way since then, but basically, I think the urge for Nepal to restore its Hindu identity is very strong, and possibly it cuts across all the political parties, and perhaps even the Maoists have come to accept the reality that it was premature and a bit of a misjudgment on their part to have forced the secular status onto the people of Nepal through really a handful of parliamentarians overnight.
Just a little bit. You've said three things at the in during this conversation. One, of course, the Chinese issue, and you said that this will become, or this is likely to become, a bigger problem, and India should be aware of that. The other thing you mentioned, of course, is that at this point in time, Chinese infrastructural investments, are not doing as well as they thought they would, and many of them, in fact, have not taken off, which gives India some leverage. You've also spoken about the rise of Islamic, hardliners and Islamism in Nepal and the problems that that issue has caused. And of course, will Nepal go back to becoming a Hindu nation once again? Now, talk to us, Ambassador, on the last point. If indeed Nepal were to go back to becoming a Hindu state, what would be the route? Do you see the revival, in a sense, once again, of the monarchy? What would be the route through which it would go back?
No, that is uh, an incipient movement that has already started. Pro-monarchists have already started calling for return of a monarchy because, again, there is a lot of popular disenchantment with, the failure of political parties to deliver on governance and development and so on. But I don't think the urge to restore the monarchy is as strong as the urge to restore its Hindu identity. And it's just that it is possibly a different kind of Hindu identity, which is quite special to Nepal. Nepal, until recently, had never seen a communal riot, for example. And while Islamic fundamentalists have increased their presence, etc., there is no real anti-Muslim feeling. It's not as if religion divides people in Nepal, but that is beginning to happen now. So I think it should be really left to the people of Nepal to decide how exactly that would be done. But as I said, there is this urge to consult India, and I have a feeling that India will be consulted after the elections on what India would like to see. And my hope would be that India would be very, very careful this time around, because last time, and this is something which is part of Nepal's historical memory, they feel that India had a role in bringing about this huge transformation of Nepal from a Hindu monarchy to a secular state. And they feel that India had a role, and thereby, there are some complications in terms of India's image, India's credibility, etc. So India will have to be a little careful on that front.
As we come towards the end of our conversation, I want to talk to you about how climate change will impact these regions. We are seeing this is not often discussed in strategic conversations, but we're seeing the impact of climate change, for instance, in Bangladesh. And more people are beginning to talk about what will happen in Bangladesh, and indeed what will happen between India and Bangladesh if climate change impacts Bangladesh in the manner in which it is supposed to. Talk to us a little bit about climate change and its impact in the Himalayan region, in Nepal. Does that have an impact in Indo-Nepalese relationship?
I think there's no doubt about it that glaciers in the Himalayas are melting many times faster now than they were in earlier decades. And Nepal is already on the brink of a major crisis, I would say. There are forest fires raging all over Nepal, even today as we speak, because of climate change. And this is going to impact on India, and it's going to impact on a wider region because Himalayas are so important for the world. Uh, I would not say that climate change would directly affect India-Nepal relations, except for the fact that India is not giving the priority that is necessary in its bilateral conversations with Nepal on working together as partners in preventing a catastrophe due to climate change. But it is happening. It is happening at a very fast pace, and it is going to affect Nepal very, very seriously in the very near future, I would say. It's a very major, major crisis which is around the corner. No doubt about that.
Let's then conclude by talking about the issue that you began with. China. Even as Nepal, even as this movement builds in Nepal to take it back to its Hindu identity, what role do you think are the Chinese playing in trying to perhaps stop or stall this, or perhaps they're not being able to stall it? How do you see this dynamic play out? What role? How do you see China, looking at this entire movement to take Nepal back to its Hindu identity? And how do you think China will respond or is responding to something like this?
I have a feeling that the Chinese are not overly bothered about Nepal getting back its Hindu identity, nor about Nepal possibly restoring the monarchy, because in years past they've always enjoyed very good relations with the palace. They dropped the palace only when it was clear that King Gyanendra was on his way out. I think they are really focusing on bringing the leftist forces together, and they have made no secret about that as a top priority. And, it is interesting that as soon as the present coalition took over, Prachanda continues as prime minister, but he dropped his earlier coalition partner, Sher Bahadur Deuba of the Nepali Congress, all of a sudden, and opted to return to his coalition partnership with KP Sharma Oli of the Communist Party. So what you have now is a revival of the left. They are trying to play it down, and the Chinese are also keeping a low profile. But there is no doubt in my mind that it is advantage China at the moment. It is interesting that China was the first country which welcomed the change. The first country that was visited by the new foreign minister of Nepal was China. There were exchanges of military visits, new agreements have been signed. So the Chinese are pinning their hopes on a united left front, which will be more responsive to what they want to do in Nepal. And I'm afraid the indications are that a leftist government, if it lasts long enough, the situation is very unstable and one doesn't know when the government might change again. But a revival of the left would essentially mean that a lot of things that India does not want to see happening in Nepal may begin to happen. I still recall a visit to Kolkata soon after I became ambassador when I took Manmohan Adhikari, Nepal's first prime minister, communist prime minister, when they took over after an anti-India agitation. I went over to Nepal as ambassador. And Adhikari paid an official visit to India, and I took him to Kolkata. And we met Jyoti Bosu, where we had a very cordial conversation together. But then Jyoti Basu asked Manmohan Adhikari to leave us alone so that he could have a private chat with me. Basically, what he told me was, don't fall for this, uh, you know, superficial goodwill or even sincere goodwill on the part of Manmohan Adhikari towards India, etc., because he does not represent the leftist forces in Nepal. He was thinking more of the Maoists who were slowly making their appearance. But he basically said that leftist forces in Nepal would really not bother about good relations with India. And India should watch out for that. This was Jyoti Bose who talked to me, a communist icon in India. I still remember that very vividly. Now, it is up to the united left, as it were, in Nepal to prove that this is not correct. Because we have worked closely with the Communist Party of Nepal, we have worked closely with Prachanda. Off and on, both have become very, very anti-India. But I think this whole business about pro-India and anti-India, it's not a rigid thing. It's not cast in stone. Uh, People become pro or anti-India depending on how they perceive their security vis-a-vis India. If they feel that India is being blatantly partisan in another camp, then they become much more anti-India. So it's a question of managing uh, uh, the revival of the left. It is a question of building trust more than anything else. And I must say that the factor that has been lacking in India-Nepal relations right from the beginning has been empathy. India has not been able to empathize with Nepal in the sense that we simply do not understand what it means to be a small landlocked country like Nepal, uh, surrounded by India with overwhelming influence on all fronts by India, etc. We are somewhat insensitive to Nepal's problems and Nepal's syndrome of a landlocked country. So I think we should show greater sensitivity. If we show greater sensitivity and if we try to focus on consensus building across the political spectrum, irrespective of who's in power and who is not, then I think we will be on a much better wicket. The Chinese would be focusing basically on the left. They would perhaps be focusing on rightist forces. But we have an advantage which they don't have, and that is the civilizational links, etc., etc., which can be leveraged very much to our advantage. And I hope that we will be able to do that.
I have one last question before we wrap up, Ambassador, which is the two big things clearly are happening. One is this consolidation of the left forces, as you call them, and the other is this demand for the revival of Nepal to become a Hindu state once again. Do these do these two consolidations, so to speak, balance each other, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, it all depends on what happens. My own feeling is that the monarchy over the years uh, was looked at with a certain strong prejudice from the Indian side. They were considered to be rigorously anti-India. Now, I remember Mr. Rasgotra, former foreign secretary, who had three postings in Nepal, including as ambassador. He used to tell us, and he said this in public. He said King Mahendra of Nepal, who was considered to be the most anti-India of Nepalese kings, would have been the most pro-India of them all if India had treated him differently. I take that very, very seriously. My own experience was that King Birendra, who was considered to be staunchly anti-India because he launched the zone of peace proposal on the day of his coronation, and subsequently, Rajiv Gandhi had to warn him, and he became very pro-China and so on. But he became so friendly towards India that he was invited to India as chief guest on India's Republic Day. And our president and our prime minister and many leaders from India visited Nepal. And they would tell me that this is not the King Birendra we used to know earlier. So this business of pro and anti-India can change. and King Gyanendra, who also has credentials as being very severely anti-India, he has himself told me personally that he has no such prejudice against India. In fact, he has great admiration for India and he would like to work closely with India. And maybe he has learned his lessons too. So it is a question of how we manage the palace if the monarchy comes back, how we manage the leftists if they become a very strong force, and how we keep up our very close relations with the other political players and at the civil society level in Nepal. We have nothing to worry about in Nepal because at the end of the day, I'm convinced that even when the Nepalese appear to be against this particular policy of India or that particular policy or critical of India, etc., no Nepali is capable of being profoundly anti-India in the sense that we would see in other countries. It is just not possible. The linkages, the bondings are just too strong. So it is a question of how we play the cards.
That was absolutely delightful and very, very insightful, Ambassador. You spoke about a bunch of very key things from China's role to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism to, of course, the revival perhaps of Nepal becoming a Hindu state once again, and of course the role of monarchy in India-Nepal relations, which of course now has the Chinese shadow looming over it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and congratulations for a wonderful new book on India Nepal, a brilliant book which really gives context and depth in understanding this unique relationship. Ambassador Rajan, thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your kindness and for your courtesies. Thank you.